how would you prove that some action or somebody is not selfish?
How would I prove that it's not selfish?
Yeah.
That's the point. I don't think that you can prove anything to not be selfish. But I think you could prove anything to be selfish, everything to be selfish.
I think what Alex was pointing to in that if you can't prove that it cannot be selfish.
For something to be unfalsifiable means there's no test you can perform to distinguish whether or not it exists or it does not exist. So being unfalsifiable makes it completely it's a non-concept.
Why would we be discussing the whole concept of selfishness if it couldn't be a concept? I'm saying that in our concept of what selfishness is, we are selfish. We are self-serving.
My question would be, what is the purpose of calling somebody selfish if you are defining selfish in a way that it necessarily applies to all activities all the time? What possible discriminative power does this word have? Why would you ever, if it really means what you claim it means, why would you ever want to use this word to describe anything about anybody?
What is a way to judge whether a person is acting selfish or not? My definition of how to make this judgment is you can only do this by taking a third person view or a look at what's happening. So there's no way that you would know if the person who's doing the good deed is getting pleasure out of it or not simply by looking at the situation. And by your definition, you have to then speak to the person who's doing the good deed and verify whether he's getting pleasure out of it or not. And I don't think that's a good way of passing the judgment.
That's a really good point, Eugene. And I was going to ask a question, actually. Here's a way that I can see it being falsified. You do a scientific test. You do a brain scan of someone. Let's say we completely map out the human brain and we know where all the pleasure centers are. Mm-hmm. So if this person's not getting any pleasure out of this, I can't see it being as serving his or herself. I don't know. Would you agree with that sort of definition?
Sorry, could you repeat that definition, please?
If I were to define being selfish as doing something that gives me no pleasure, and let's say the byproduct of this action is well-being of someone else, right? I can describe that as selfless, but I can equally describe it as selfless if it serves nobody.
Well, that would be awesome if you defined it that way. I win by default because that's clearly we do a lot of things that do make us very miserable on purpose.
And
but
with reason too.
Well, for example, when you're sacrificing your organ or a portion of your organ for somebody else, you're clearly harming yourself. But then the counter argument of everyone's selfish is, well, he's doing it because he's gonna feel better about it. But the fact that he's destroying his body has no bearing on this whatsoever.
The way that we use the word selfish is it has negative connotations, and I think that's the reason why people feel less inclined to say that all human beings are selfish. But and Felipe said the word pleasure, and I think that's an important thing to sort of debunk, because I don't necessarily think that everything we do that we get something out of necessarily gives us pleasure or joy. Let's say I jumped in front of a car to save somebody, and the person died and I was seriously injured, and I had to suffer through all of these terrible pains and just agony, and I didn't even save the person. I wouldn't get joy out of that. But the action itself, I think the reason why I did it would have been because I thought I could get something out of it. I thought I could get the joy of saving somebody's life. So I took the risk.
It's kind of like putting up with the pain for now for the pleasure for later kind of thing.
Yeah. So essentially, your argument presupposes that people think rationally and act rationally. It's almost like you're saying that somebody weighed this sort of cost-benefit analysis and determined this. But if we're going to be taking an objective view of this, we have to compare what people actually do to what a rational agent would do. And if we can show that what people do is like systematically bad for them, then I would say they're not rational. And if they're not rational, it's difficult to say that what they do is always in their best interest, because that's only something that a rational agent would do. I don't even need to bring up examples. I'm sure you would all agree that humans' behavior in economics, with loss aversion, hundreds of fallacies that make us make absurd decisions economically and otherwise, they just prove that we're not rational agents.
Yeah. Shoot, I was about to ask you if you can name anything that we do that is not ultimately self-serving, like any sort of.
One thing that's not ultimately self-serving is, for example, like emitting a lot of greenhouse gases.
People don't drive cars because they think that, you know, the pollution that cars create is going to be great. People drive cars because they would rather get around faster.
Time span, because if you look at any activity that would bring, that would increase the chance of the entire human race dying, really it's not a self-serving in the ultimate sense. And the question was, is there any action that is not ultimately self-serving? So if you're talking about ultimately self-serving, I think the complete annihilation of the human race would probably be a non-self-serving action, like situation.
But at the same time, like, we know in this lifetime, we're not likely going to see a lot of the human race. We're going to be done, and human race will continue. And so we won't be selves in that time. We won't be people, unless you believe in reincarnation, which is a whole different thing. If you do, for those of you out there who believe in reincarnation. But like, we don't think of ourselves really as being the grand scheme of humankind. We think of ourselves as singular entities in this time, right?